We were all way too quick to jump to conclusions about what went wrong on defense, and honestly, this file forces us to slow down and reevaluate almost everything we thought we knew. The narrative for months was simple. The Lions needed a new defensive coordinator, that Kelvin Shepherd wasn't the guy, that the scheme didn't work, that the defense collapsed when it mattered most. But when you actually extract what happened on the field and line it up with the numbers and the context, the picture gets a lot more uncomfortable for all of us who were yelling for change. Start with this, because it immediately messes with the eye test. The Detroit Lions finished tied for 4th in the entire NFL in sacks with 49. Not middle of the pack, not scraping by. 4th, they were also 6th in pressures. If I had told you that during the season, while we were watching games week to week, you probably would have laughed. Most of us felt like the quarterback always had time, like nobody could get home outside of Aiden Hutchinson. And yet, those numbers are real. They're not opinions, they're not spin, they happened. Now here's where it gets interesting, because this is where the disconnect lives. Quarterbacks took the 4th longest time to throw against the Lions in the NFL, almost 3 full seconds on average. At the same time, Detroit's pressure took the 3rd longest to arrive, about 2.86 seconds. That combination tells you something very specific. A huge portion of those sacks were coverage sacks. The defensive backs were holding up long enough to force quarterbacks to hesitate, reset, drift, and eventually go down. That's not what any of us were saying during the season. The common belief was that the coverage was the weak link. According to this, the coverage was actually doing far more heavy lifting than we gave it credit for, even with injuries on the back end. And that's where the conversation about Kelvin Shepherd changes. If you're playing press man, if you're telling quarterbacks you're not giving them anything short or easy, then by design you are asking your coverage to survive longer snaps. That's the trade-off. You either get the ball out quick against soft zones, or you hold it and hope your receivers win late. Detroit forced quarterbacks into the second option more often than almost anyone else. The frustration wasn't that the defense didn't function at all. The frustration was that it didn't look clean, it didn't look dominant, and it didn't feel consistent. So if the scheme wasn't completely broken, then what was? The file keeps circling back to the same answer. Talent, specifically pass rush talent outside of Hutchinson, Aiden Hutchinson being 4th in the NFL in sacks, covers up a lot of sins. Once you move past him, it gets uncomfortable fast. When Alim McNeill was healthy, there was at least an inside-out threat. Chip Hutchinson and McNeill wrecks the guard when in one, but once McNeill went down, that disappeared. Suddenly, offenses could slide protection, Chip Hutchinson, and dare anyone else to beat them. Nobody consistently did. Look at it historically within this roster. The year before, Levi Onwuzurike had the 2nd most pressures on the entire team. Let that sink in. If that's your 2nd best pressure source, you're surviving on fumes. This past season, you're talking about players like Alkawaden Muhammad, a journeyman who is actually maximized by the coaching staff. That's not an indictment of coaching. That's an indictment of depth. When a guy like that is being used correctly, and still the pressure isn't enough, it tells you the ceiling of the unit is capped by personnel, not play calling. And that's why the entire conversation inevitably drifts toward adding another elite edge. Not because it's flashy, not because fans want a headline, but because the way this defense is built absolutely requires it. You cannot live in press man, force long developing routes, and survive with one real pass rusher. Every example around the league supports that. Elite edges thrive when there's another problem offenses have to account for. One star can be neutralized to change everything. This is also where the mindset shift shows up. The Lions aren't rebuilding anymore. This isn't a theoretical window. This is the window. Prime players, prime contracts, prime opportunity. Every year resets the equation. Coaches change. Injuries happen. One retirement flips the math. Sitting back and waiting for everything to align perfectly isn't how you capitalize on moments like this. That realization alone changes how you evaluate risk, contracts, and aggressive moves. And that brings us to the real fork in the road. Because once you accept that the scheme can work and the coverage is holding longer than we thought, the only missing ingredient is consistent pressure from multiple angles. If that piece gets added, you're no longer talking about a defense that survives. You're talking about one that dictates. You're talking about a unit that makes those long throws impossible instead of just uncomfortable. So the question becomes less about whether the defense is fundamentally flawed and more about how far it could actually go with one major addition on the edge, and whether this front office should lean fully into that reality right now. With all of that in mind, do you believe the Lions should aggressively chase that 2nd elite pass rusher to unlock this defense? Or do you still think patience and internal development is the smarter path at this stage? Once you accept that this defense wasn't as broken as it felt, the rest of the conversation starts to line up fast. Because if coverage sacks were a real thing here, if quarterbacks truly had to hold the ball longer against Detroit than against almost anyone else, then the margin between frustrating defense and dominant defense suddenly feels a lot thinner than we thought. It's not about reinventing the system. It's about feeding the system what it needs to actually breathe. This is where the pass rush math becomes impossible to ignore. Hutchinson did his job. Over and over again, he did exactly what an elite edge defender is supposed to do. He bent the pocket, he forced quarterbacks to step up, he created chaos off the edge. But football doesn't work in isolation. When the quarterback steps up and there's nobody collapsing the middle, the entire play resets. You saw Hutchinson beat his man, fly past a quarterback, and then almost stop mid-rush because the quarterback had nowhere to go but forward. That's not failure. That's an incomplete equation. Interior pressure matters, and a healthy Ollie McNeil changes that dynamic. No question. But even that only gets you part of the way there. Offenses can still slide, still chip, still dictate protections when there's only one true edge threat. The moment you add a second one, everything flips. Protections become honest, chips disappear, one-on-ones multiply. Coverage doesn't need to survive for 3 seconds anymore because the quarterback doesn't have 3 seconds. That's why the idea of pairing Hutchinson with another elite defensive end isn't a luxury, it's a force multiplier. It doesn't just add sacks, it changes the way offenses call plays against you. Suddenly, those low-percentage deep balls become panic throws instead of calculated risks. Suddenly, that press man coverage everyone complained about looks sticky and aggressive instead of reckless. The same scheme, the same coaching, a completely different result. And this is where the salary cap discussion stops being scary and starts being strategic. The cap isn't a hard wall the way people think it is. It's a tool. Contracts can be restructured, money can be pushed, space can be created without detonating the future if you're disciplined about how you do it. This isn't about reckless spending, it's about aligning your resources with your competitive timeline. When your core players are in their prime, when you're already close, hoarding flexibility for a hypothetical future starts to make less sense. What's important here is that nothing about this conversation requires blind optimism. Even the file makes it clear. Maybe that elite edge isn't available. Maybe the price is too high. Maybe the phone call never gets returned. That's all possible, but what's no longer debatable is the diagnosis. The defense wasn't failing because the coaching staff didn't know what it was doing. It was surviving because it didn't have enough firepower to fully execute what it wanted to be. And that realization should shift how we judge last season entirely. The defense wasn't collapsing randomly, it was stretching itself to compensate. Defensive backs were asked to cover longer than almost anyone else in the league. Hutchinson was asked to be both the spark and the finisher. Role players were asked to punch above their weight. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but the structure held. Now imagine that same structure with one more dominant piece. Not a rotational body, not a project, a real game-altering threat. Suddenly, you're not arguing about whether this defense is good enough to support a championship run. You're asking how many offenses can actually handle it. That's why this moment matters. The Lions aren't guessing anymore. They're not hoping to be relevant. They're deciding how aggressive they want to be while the window is open. And windows don't announce when they're closing. They just are, until they aren't. So now it's on you. Knowing what this defense actually did, knowing how close it might be to flipping from frustrating to terrifying, do you think Detroit should fully lean into win-now mode and make that bold move to complete the pass rush? Or would you still rather see them stay conservative and trust that internal growth will be enough? And this is where the conversation really turns from theory into urgency. Because once you frame it this way, standing still almost becomes the riskiest option of all. If you accept that the defense already did the hard part by surviving structurally, then waiting for maybe players to develop into something they've never been starts to feel less like patience and more like gambling. Development is important, but development rarely turns average edge rushers into difference makers overnight. Pressure is one of the most expensive commodities in football for a reason. What keeps jumping out from the file is how thin the margin already was. The Lions weren't getting carved up quickly, they were getting beaten late in the down. That matters. Late down failures are usually a sign of either exhausted coverage or insufficient pressure. The coverage already proved it can hold longer than most people realized. That leaves pressure as the missing lever. Fix that, and a lot of last season's frustrations don't disappear magically, but they make sense in hindsight. This also reframes how you judge the defensive backs moving forward. When a secondary is asked to play tight coverage for extended snaps without consistent help up front, mistakes are inevitable. It's not a lack of ability, it's physics. Quarterbacks eventually find space if they're allowed to reset their feet. Take away that reset, and suddenly those same defensive backs look far more disciplined, far more aggressive, far more confident. The narrative flips without changing the personnel. The biggest takeaway here is that this isn't about chasing headlines or making fans feel good. In March, it's about alignment, scheme, personnel, timeline, and cap strategy all have to point in the same direction. Right now, they do. The Lions know who they are defensively. They know how they want to play. The only real question left is how bold they're willing to be to finish the job. Because if you don't act when the structure is already in place, you risk wasting the years where everything else is lined up. Windows don't stay open because you played it safe. They stay open because you leaned into them at the right moment. The defense doesn't need to be reinvented. It needs to be unleashed. There's one more layer to this that really shouldn't be ignored, because it explains why so many people, including us, misread the defense in real time. Watching live football, pressure that arrives late feels useless. A quarterback drifting, resetting, and finally dumping the ball off or throwing a contested completion burns into your memory way more than a sack that happens 3 seconds into the play. But over a full season, those late pressures and coverage sacks add up. And that's exactly what the numbers in this file are exposing. The Lions weren't a defense that failed instantly. They were a defense that stressed offenses snap after snap and then eventually cracked because they didn't have enough ways to finish plays. That's a very different problem than being schematically lost. One can be fixed by adding talent, the other usually requires blowing things up. Detroit is clearly in the first category. That's also why the emotional reaction during the season leans so heavily toward blaming coaching. When you see quarterbacks complete throws while falling away or stepping up calmly, it feels like the call must be wrong. But when quarterbacks are holding the ball longer than against almost anyone else in the league, that suggests the calls are actually doing their job. They're just not being rewarded consistently because the rush can't close the loop. And that loop is everything. Defense only works when all three levels talk to each other. Coverage buys time. Rush collapses space. Linebackers clean up. If one piece is late or missing, the entire structure looks worse than it actually is. The Lions were asking their coverage to overperform to compensate for a thin pass rush. For long stretches, it did. But that's not sustainable across a full season, especially against top quarterbacks. This is why the idea of just one more guy isn't lazy analysis here. It's accurate. One more legitimate edge threat doesn't just improve one position, it recalibrates the workload for everyone else. Hutchinson doesn't have to be perfect every snap. Defensive backs don't have to plaster forever. The scheme doesn't have to rely on timing luck. Everything becomes sharper and faster. And once you see that, it becomes harder to justify half measures. Rotational depth helps, development helps, draft picks help, but none of those guarantee the immediate impact that this specific defense is missing. When you're already close, incremental gains don't always move the needle enough. Sometimes you need a move that forces offenses to change their game plan the moment they turn on the film. That's the crossroads the Lions are standing at right now. The defense isn't asking for a reset, it's asking for reinforcement. Whether the front office decides to answer that call aggressively or cautiously will tell us a lot about how seriously they view this moment in the team's arc. At this point, the uncomfortable truth is that the Lions already showed us who they are defensively, and we just didn't recognize it